Hi, government students. Mr. Rosenleaf coming at you, and today we're going to talk about federalism, which is the topic of Chapter 4 in your textbook, and we're just going to kind of talk through the straight basics here and kind of go from there. It's not everything that's in the book. The book goes into a little more detail on this, but this is just kind of the high points, and we'll kind of go from there. All right, so federalism. Simple definition: system of government in which the same territory is controlled by two levels of government, both the national government and a smaller political subdivision. And they both have the power to make laws, and both have a certain level of autonomy from each other. Okay, so two levels of government, and you might be saying, well, wait a minute, what about local government? Isn't that three levels? And yeah, but state government is considered sort of a part of, or local government is considered kind of a part of state government. So, yeah, they're kind of lumped together. So in practice, what this kind of looks like is, the U.S. system that we're supposed to have. So the national government has the authority to do certain things, the state government has the authority to do certain things, and there are certain things that are shared responsibilities. So the national government can, for example, according to this lovely graphic here that you can certainly take a screen capture of, or you can look up federalism graphic in Google image search, and you will find 95 of these. The national government can obviously declare war, and the state government can't declare war. They can maintain armed forces. And you're going, well, what about the National Guard? Well, the National Guard is actually maintained federally. Now, used to be the militias were maybe a little different. It's actually a little cleaner now under our current system, kind of. Regulate interstate and foreign trade. Obviously, state governments can't do that because they're the ones doing the trading. And so they can't regulate it, because if one side is regulating, then it may not be fair to the other side. And on it goes. Admit new states, establish post offices, set standards of weights and measures. It would be bad if Montana set the weight of a pound and California's pound was not the same, or Texas's or North Dakota's or whatever. That would be bad. The state government's coining money would not be a good thing. There would be certain states that would do nothing but print money, and they would have massive inflation, and other states would barely print any money, and yeah. Establish foreign policy. Yeah, states really can't do that. Now, can states have like sister state relationships with, other smaller entities within other countries? Yeah, I think Great Falls has a sister community relationship. Things like that. I mean, that kind of stuff's allowed. Make all laws necessary and proper for the carrying out of the delegated powers to the national government. Now, for the states, they get to establish and maintain schools. There are no federal schools. Now, does the federal government now wade into funding for schools and things like that, and maybe setting standards for lunches and things like that? Yes. But as far as setting up the schools, running the schools, that's a state matter. Establishing local governments. The only local government the federal government establishes is Washington, D.C.'s, and also any territories. Regulate businesses within their state. Yeah, Idaho can't tell us, what Dragonfly Dry Goods downtown can do. That doesn't work. Make marriage laws. There is no federal marriage law. Now, was there a law called the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, that tried to define, what marriage was federally? Yes, but the federal government can't marry people. That's up to the states. Provide for public safety. Yeah. Does federal government also do this? Yeah, but it's different. Assume other powers not delegated to the national government or prohibited to the states. Yep, they can do all that. And then there are things they can both could do. Maintain law and order. So that's more like what the federal government could do, is maintain law and order. Public safety is more of a state issue, city issue. levy taxes. Both of them can tax. Borrow money. They can both borrow money. Now, the difference is the federal government can borrow money and run what's called a budget deficit or a shortfall. They can have a debt, an ongoing deficit. State governments can't really do that. If they borrow money, it has to be repaid by a certain time. There's a length of, they have to take out what are called bonds. And so there is a length of time by which they have to have that paid back. Same with local governments, same with school districts. The Great Falls Public Schools, for example, several years ago, did a big campaign to get the voters to agree to take out bonds for the schools so that we could construct like Giant Springs Elementary and the new Longfellow, and build that addition onto CMR and build the STEM building here at Great Falls High, or the addition onto Great Falls High, the STEM building onto here at CMR. Sorry, been a long day. So things like that. So yeah, we can take on debt, but we have to have a plan to pay it back, and it has to be paid back within a certain time frame. The states and the federal government can charter banks. Banks, credit unions, things like that. They can establish courts. There are state courts, there are federal courts. Provide for the public welfare. So all of these things are shared responsibilities. Now, back in the day, the thought of federalism was the picture on the left. And that's what's called layer cake federalism or dual federalism, where the federal government has its layer, the state government has its layer. I don't know why we have a third layer, but the powers are very separated, very you have your own layer and you stick to it, and they're not really supposed to mix, but of course they always have, because they always have shared powers. And so, but the idea of the layer cake federalism, that federalism is this layer cake, that lasts really up until about the 1930s. Coincidentally, this is about the time of the New Deal, where the federal government becomes involved in lots and lots of other areas that it hadn't previously been involved in, because there was a national emergency dictating that it is so. And so the federal government gets involved in all sorts of things that prior to that no federal politician had ever thought of. And there are still politicians and government officials to this day that think we never should have been involved in the first place, because it's a violation of federalism. But the current sort of idea of federalism, although in light of recent political events, maybe we're trying to go back more towards that layer cake federalism, or maybe we're mixing the marble cake more. But the current idea is this marble cake, where there aren't layers. I don't even know how necessarily to describe this. Instead of these insulated layers where the federal government has this and the state governments have this, marble cake federalism was coined in the 1960s to view federalism as a more complex and sort of interactive thing. That the relationship between the federal and the state governments is one where all jurisdictions are kind of inter-involved to a certain extent. There aren't necessarily formal lines of division. I mean, there are some hard and fasts, but anymore, you see the federal government getting involved in state things, and recently you've seen state governments getting involved in things that they have not been involved in before. You have states like Washington, Oregon, California, and I think I just heard Hawaii has jumped in on this, as the federal government has started dismantling mandates for vaccines and research into vaccines. Those states have gotten together and said, okay, we're going to help each other out. We're going to form kind of an interstate compact kind of a thing, where we're going to help each other out to help protect our citizens, because the federal government's not going to do that anymore. And I would guess we're probably going to see more of that in certain states as those states seem to feel that the federal government is not living up to what had been up to that point their responsibility. So yeah, the two ideas again: layer cake, marble cake. Strict layers, no strict layers. All right, so one of the really important things about federalism is what's known as the necessary and proper clause, also known as the elastic clause. This is one of the things that helps the national government get involved in more than what the Constitution originally had set out for it to get involved in. This would be one of the things that, if you think back to a discussion you might have had in U.S. history last year, I know in my classes we talk about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the people that wanted sort of strong national government versus people that wanted a limited national government and more power for the states. The people that wanted the stronger national government proposed this necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. I don't know if it was actually Alexander Hamilton, but he would have been all for this. So the clause states in it, Article 1, so the clause about Congress, or the article about Congress, Section 8, Clause 18. And again, necessary and proper clause, aka the elastic clause. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So, kind of old school language, what that means is if Congress needs to do its job, but carrying out that job means that they're getting into something that's not necessarily explicitly stated in the Constitution, they can pass a law that helps them do one of their main tasks, one of their main jobs, responsibilities. They can pass laws to help make that happen. Because the founders sort of realized that they weren't going to be able to foresee everything that was going to come up that was going to be necessary to do the job. And so the idea of having this sort of, I've heard this referred to as the catch-all clause, that, if it's important enough for the federal government to take up, this is the clause that generally sort of allows them to take it up. So one example of this would be McCulloch versus Maryland. And in McCulloch versus Maryland, Maryland attempted to place a tax on the second bank of the United States. If you think back to potentially what you talked about in U.S. history last year, although it's not super part of our curriculum anymore, we had a first bank of the United States that Alexander Hamilton had helped set up as a compromise with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And then Jefferson, during his term in office, had killed the bank. Then the War of 1812 happens, and we realize, gee, we really need a bank. Fighting the war without, centralized financing was bad, was difficult. So we established a second bank in the United States. And this bank had also fallen out of favor. Andrew Jackson had come around, and Jackson didn't trust national power, even though he was seeking to become the chief executive and became one of the most powerful ones, the most powerful one to that point in history. And so Jackson and his followers, some of which lived in Maryland, tried to put a tax on the second bank of the United States, which was headquartered in Maryland. And by doing this, they wanted to try and drive the bank out of existence. And the Supreme Court, and when I say SCOTUS, S-C-O-T-U-S, I'm abbreviating Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court ruled against Maryland. It said if a state has the power to tax an entity of the federal government, it can use that tax as a punishment of the federal government, meaning that the state would have power over the federal government, and that's not okay. States are subordinate to the federal government in many, many ways, and one state cannot unilaterally try and get rid of some aspect of the federal government or federal power just because it doesn't like it. And that, again, McCulloch versus Maryland, which was a case decided in 1819. Now, sometimes this clause, this necessary and proper clause, this elastic clause, is sometimes taken to mean convenient and useful. Again, catch-all. If the federal government wants to get involved in something it really wants to, this is the argument they're going to go to. Now, oftentimes, the federal courts will agree with that. Say, yeah, this is something they need to do to carry out this power, that power, etc. But sometimes the Supreme Court's going to say, no, this is not something you ever needed to get involved in. You don't have this power. So it does work both ways, although more often than not, I think it's the federal government power is upheld over the state. Yeah. So another one of these clauses that is often used to help establish federal power is this thing called the Commerce Clause. And this one, again, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Okay, so this says that the national government shall have the power to regulate commerce, either between the United States and another government or another country, amongst the states themselves, so between, say, New York and New Jersey, or between the United States and the Native American tribes and Native American nations that exist within the borders of the United States. And this one, and I brought up New York and New Jersey for a reason, because they're the parties kind of represented in this case. I mean, it's not New York versus New Jersey, but it's Gibbons versus Ogden. And what this case basically says is that it's Congress, not the states, that can regulate trade between the states. So this case came down to there were two steam shipping companies. Basically, they weren't even steamboats at that point because we're talking the early 1800s. And so there was one, and New York had given this one and I don't remember if it was Gibbons or Ogden, okay? But New York had chartered one. They'd said, okay, you are the official company that can run goods between New York and New Jersey. And New Jersey had taken the other one and said, okay, you're the official way to get goods from New Jersey to New York. And of course, they're not just going to go there and turn around and come back empty-handed. They're going to fill their ships. And so we get into this conflict. New York gave me the exclusive right to operate steamships. Oh, it was steamship in New York waters, and the other one says wrong. New York gave the United States the exclusive right to regulate interstate commerce because New York had passed the Constitution. So this was yet another case when the federal government power was established to be the one that could make this decision. If it was, between New York City and Albany, then yeah, New York can handle that. If it's between Newark and Jersey City, then yeah, New Jersey can handle that. But if it's between Jersey City and New York City, then that goes across state lines, and we have a problem. Now, the Commerce Clause can now also be used. It's not a catch-all, but the federal government does use this clause to get into a number of things because they say, well, a lot of this stuff travels over state lines. For example, illegal drugs. Drugs are essentially a state issue, but the federal government said, well, no, because they're coming from somewhere. They're not frequently, grown there, especially if it's something like cocaine, right? Not a lot of places in America grow coca. So if it's traveling across state lines, the federal government has an interest in it. Same with like mail bombers. The Unabomber was convicted of federal crimes because he mailed bombs via the U.S. mail, number one, which handles interstate mail, even if it's being sent within the state, and number two, from one state to another. And therefore, the Federal Bureau of Investigation could get involved in that case. Federal civil rights laws. When we're talking about the case was like the Freedom Riders, where these folks were riding interstate buses from state to state to state, and they were facing different laws in different places, even though they were on the same bus. The federal government was able to step in and say, no, this is an interstate bus. We have an interest in this because this stuff crosses state lines. Healthcare laws, the interstate highway system. And for a while, the federal government was actually even able to set speed limits on the interstate highway system. Nowadays, they've sort of released their grip on that, and states can set, to a certain extent, their own standards. But for a while, all interstate highways were set at 65 miles an hour. And the way the federal government cracked down on that was they used highway funding as sort of their carrot and stick. If you wanted the highway money, which most states can't pave their own roads without federal money, it's just too expensive, you had to set your speed limit at 65 miles an hour. Montana, which prior to that had had regular speed limits and everything, when the federal government stepped in and said, okay, you have to set your speed limit at 65 because Montana's speed limits had been higher. Montana got back at them by establishing a $5 speeding fine. My father-in-law used to travel regularly between Great Falls and Havre, and he would just stop by the bank and pick up a wad of fives, and he would spend $25 on the way to Havre, go as fast as he wanted. He'd get pulled over. The cop would say, okay, it's a $5 fine. You could pay the cop. You could pay the highway patrolman of the money. So interstate highways, again, they could use this. They could even use it to set speed limits. Now, eventually, they get rid of that. Tennessee Valley Authority, Hoover Dam, because the electricity was going to various states, the federal government could take control of that sort of thing. And then finally, the Supremacy Clause. This is the thing that says, and I'm going to read it to you, the Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Again, old school language. What this means is that the laws made by the federal government, and especially the Constitution, the laws in the Constitution are absolutely 100% supreme. Okay? State governments cannot violate the U.S. Constitution. And over time, we have even taken that to include the amendments. For a while, the amendments were not necessarily a part of that. And they've ruled that no, even the amendments are supreme law of the land. And same thing goes with like treaties. Treaties between, say, the United States and Great Britain, or the United States and Mexico, or whatever, have the same force of law as a part of the Constitution. They are supreme. States cannot just get rid of them. They cannot alter them. They are supreme. So the Supremacy Clause, if you want to think of it as in a graphic form, is like a ladder. At the top of the ladder is the U.S. Constitution, and right below that, federal laws and treaties. Below that go the state constitutions. So the state constitutions also cannot violate the U.S. Constitution. Now, they can give rights that the U.S. Constitution does not give. but they can't take away anything the U.S. Constitution has given. Number 4, state laws. Number 5, local laws. So that's sort of the hierarchy with the Constitution at the top. Pardon me. So the Supremacy Clause is also known as the linchpin of the Constitution. When the U.S. Constitution comes into conflict with the state constitution, the U.S. Constitution always wins. And the umpire of this, the decider of this, is, of course, the Supreme Court of the United States. So a few cases that have involved the Supremacy Clause: Ware versus Hilton. This one involved a Virginia statute from the Revolutionary War allowing the state to confiscate debt payments by Virginia citizens to British creditors. The Supreme Court found that this Virginia statute was inconsistent with the Treaty of Paris with Britain, which protected the rights of British creditors and loyalists. So the Supreme Court said, yeah, no, you don't get to violate that with your state ordinance. Marbury versus Madison. This was the case where on his way out the door, John Adams had appointed a bunch of judges, and he'd left his Secretary of State to deliver the appointments, and he was supposed to deliver an appointment to a guy by the name of Marbury, and ironically, the Adams Secretary of State was a guy by the name of John Marshall. And so Marshall couldn't get it all done. I mean, he was having to deliver appointments all across the 13 states. Wasn't going to happen. And so he leaves the appointments on the Secretary of State's desk and goes off to become, dun dun dun, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. All right. So James Madison, Thomas Jefferson's new Secretary of State, walks in, sees the thing of appointments with, the sticky note from Marshall saying, "Hey, Jimmy, would you mind delivering these? Thanks a lot, Chief Justice Marshall." And Madison takes them and throws them in the circular file. Says, "I'm not delivering those. They're all Federalist appointments. I'm not delivering those." And one of the guys that was supposed to get appointed was this guy named Marbury. And Marbury's going to do what any good American does. He's going to sue. And the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, presided over by John Marshall, who rules against kind of himself and says that, yeah, you don't get to do that. That Congress cannot pass laws that are contrary to the Constitution, and the role of the judicial system is to interpret what the Constitution permits. And citing the Supremacy Clause, the court found that Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, that it was unconstitutional to the extent that it purported to enlarge the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court beyond that which had been permitted by the Constitution. So basically, Marbury's, even the position he was being appointed to, was not going to exist because of this. So Marbury didn't really rule against himself leaving the stack on the desk. They basically ruled the expansion of the judiciary, which is what Adams was filling, unconstitutional, even though he had worked for Adams. Martin versus Hunter's lessee and Cohen's versus Virginia. Supreme Court held that the Supremacy Clause and the judicial power granted in Article 3 give the Supreme Court the ultimate power to review state court decisions involving issues arising under the Constitution and laws of the United States. Therefore, the Supreme Court has the final say in matters involving federal law, including constitutional interpretation, and can overrule decisions by the state courts. And then McCulloch versus Maryland, that we already talked about, and we already talked about that one. But Marbury versus Madison is actually what establishes the power of judicial review, where the Supreme Court can take a cause of action like the one that Marbury found and rule that, the underlying law doesn't conform to the Constitution, so it's gone. All right, so We're going to end it there, but your journal topic for this week, and I apologize, it says week 16. I was recycling an old presentation, so my bad on that. So this should be week 3 journal topic. Do you think the federal government overuses the Elastic Clause and the Commerce Clause to get into too many issues that it should not be involved in? Why do you think that, or why do you not think that? And please do try to be specific. Give a couple reasons. Do a little research. It doesn't have to be a huge, long thing. Just do a little research and give some specific examples. Not just, yeah, they do. Because, yeah. Give me something specific. All right. So you can pause there and get that down if you need to. But thanks, folks. Have a great rest of your day.